You're now listening to The Bryan Callen Show. Considered the hottest podcast in the universe. Now get ready for the heat. Here's Bryan Callen.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Callen Mott's show. You see how my voice goes down when I say Mott's? Bryan Callen, Hunter Mott's show. Hunter's the guy who books people as smart as you are, Steve. And as per always, we always have somebody, we feature somebody on the show who's a lot smarter than I am. And our guest is Mr. Steve Ujifusa. I hope I'm saying it correctly in the proper, I think that sounds like a Japanese name, Steve. Am I right?
It is, yes.
Okay. I thought maybe Samoan or something, but I guess Japanese. And you wrote a book called A Man and His Ship. And let's just start with the fact that the Wall Street Journal called your book, it's the top 10 nonfiction books of 2012. Your dad, as you were saying, your father basically said, "Hey, did you see this?" And you were like, "Oh, cool." What's that like, my friend?
It was pretty exciting. It was just before Christmas. It was around December 21st, and I was at home in Philadelphia, and then all of a sudden I get this email from my father saying, "Hey, did you see this?" And I click on it. So it was a really, it was a wonderful surprise. I started writing the book as a biography and also as a maritime history thing, but then it sort of grew into a business history as well. So I guess that's why I was surprised by the Wall Street Journal. But but no, it was really a wonderful surprise.
Well, what I got out of it, Steve, was and by the way, I didn't finish my sentence before we started recording, but you're very, very lucky because I'll be in Philadelphia December. I think it's like 12th, 13th, 14th. I don't even have the dates, but I'll be at Helium doing stand-up comedy. So I expect you in the front row every show, Steve. I'll put you on my VIP
list.
Well,
I will be there. I'm right now at the McDowell Colony in New Hampshire working on my second book. And my fellowship ends in late November, so I'll be back in Philadelphia, and I'll come and see you.
So you'll reward yourself for all that hard work at that fellowship with Bryan, the Kid Callen, ladies and gentlemen.
If you thought last Christmas was exciting when the Wall Street Journal said you'd written one of the top 10 books of the year, this year's going to be even better.
Exactly. Well, no, Steve, let's move on because I'm not as important. But here's the bottom line. The book... I want to get into why you wrote this book, and it's an excellent, excellent book, but I kept thinking to myself, Steve Ujifusa has got to have, to write a book like this takes kind of courage because you're writing about a ship that kind of went out of commission. It was a marvel of engineering when it came out. But to spend all that time, 450 pages on a book, and really it's a character study of this guy who basically, William Francis Gibbs, who was considered a great naval architect and an obsessive guy, obviously. There has to be a little William Francis Gibbs in you, my friend, to spend so much time writing this book. It takes a lot of courage. It's a successful book, but man, I would have told you as your publisher or just as a person, I would have said, dude, maybe expand, maybe just, maybe you don't have to write about a guy who created this incredible shit, but it resonates because it's as much a character piece in many ways as it is about the book. Well,
it's interesting you asked that question. Why did I write that? I definitely was the kid that was always building things in my parents' basement, model ships, model cars. And I've always loved ocean liners and tall ships. What I find fascinating about them is that they're kind of total works of art. They're both works of art and engineering, and they embody so many aspects of the society in which they came from. And
explain that.
They involve art, they involve engineering, and they also involve a tremendous amount of will. The SS United States was high technology at the time, but that's a very good point. When I was pitching the book idea, the ship is in Philadelphia. It's laid up there now. It's been sitting there for 17 years, and I feel in many ways it's appropriate she's back in Philadelphia because that's where the designer William Francis Gibbs came from. He was born in 1886, and the ship itself is interesting, but then I began reading more about the man and what kind of life he led, and that's what made the book possible was this guy, William Francis Gibbs. He was a Harvard dropout. He was determined to do what he wanted to do. He was born to great privilege, but his family lost all of its money when he was in college. He had to drop out. And the quote that really stuck with me that said, I want to write about this guy was, he said, when he had to drop out, he said, if my father had not lost all of his money in 1910, I would never have amounted to anything. It took that happening to me to want to be a naval architect and pursue this dream. So that's what made him a sympathetic character to me, and I saw how his life interacted with so many aspects of the first half of the 20th century. That's what made the book possible.
That's interesting because I got that. That resonated with me. A guy who came from enormous privilege and then his father went broke. That's and it seems to me that the more as I get older and I start to look at what motivates me and certainly what motivates a lot of people to create. I just watched the great Kevin Hart to stand up. I was at the Improv, and Kevin's about 5'1", and I think probably the most successful comic right now. He just basically talks about his pain. He talks about growing up with no money. He talks about being short. He talks about all these things, and so many of these great profiles, and seem to be that way because something bad happened to them, and they are either compensating, or it's a reaction, or it's a survival mechanism, or whatnot. But most people who do a lot like this at least went through. We spend so much of our time trying to protect our children from anything bad happening to them, and I'm glad that I just think back on I never would have been a comic, for example, if I wasn't moved around country to country, and so that resonated with me as well. A guy like Gibbs who clearly, but don't you think he was such an obsessive? And he was such an unpleasant guy, and he wasn't a good family guy, and he didn't really spend time with his sons, and he didn't like chit-chat. He was an obsessive, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think he was very similar to Steve Jobs. I read the Steve Jobs biography, and I think there are a lot of very similar character traits. I think Gibbs at the end of the day was a bit more loyal to his employees and to people than Jobs, but very similar, obsessive traits. And I think the mindset was similar. So Gibbs was not trained as an engineer in the same way that Jobs was not necessarily trained as a coder. Gibbs was the sort of guy that would design a ship, and he wanted to look a certain way. Then he'd hand it to engineers and say, okay, make it look like this, and I have my reasons for it to be this way. The same way that Steve Jobs
Well, yeah, I was going to say he didn't
design the iPod.
Yeah, he wasn't an engineer, and he wasn't even very good at math.
No,
right?
He was not. And I think that and I think going back to your point about bad things happening to him, I mean, he was bullied as a kid. I mean, he came from this very proper Philadelphia family, and I think his parents wanted him to be a certain way, and he couldn't. He was the only sport he was good at tennis. When he was at Harvard, he was locked his dorm room because he was spending a lot of his free time redesigning ships. He was afraid of being picked on and people finding out what he was doing. But I think at the same time, he had, despite his, a lot of his unpleasant side, he was someone who said the best way to get things done in many ways is to be unpleasant. But
or to do it yourself, right? I mean, and one of the things about he wasn't a bad person. I mean, one of the features of the ship was its safety. I mean, he was the first guy to create, those airtight doors and things that are now standard, right? I mean, this guy, part of what made the ship such a marvel wasn't just its speed and things, but it was also its safety.
You're right. No, he felt that the ultimate example of that was the Titanic, where the owners and builders sacrificed safety for the sake of luxury. One of the reasons why the Titanic, which was built 40 years before the United States and was a little bit smaller, didn't have enough lifeboats, is that the designers said, well, let's put in 48 boats instead of 16, which was the regulation. They can get away with that. And the owner said, well, we don't want to clutter up the decks with lifeboats because then people can't see the water, they can't play deck tennis, they can't do sports. We don't want to remind people that something can go wrong.
Yeah.
So
that sounds like 2007. That's weird.
No,
were they modeling it after the economy in 2007? Yeah.
That's a good analogy. And I think that Gibbs said that it is in many ways a crime to design a ship that's not as safe as you can build it because it'll cost you more in the long run. And ultimately, it almost drove White Star Line, the owners of the Titanic, out of business. And guess who financed the Titanic? Guess which famous banker did?
J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan. Yeah, J.P. Morgan died a year later. And the Wall Street Journal said of him, the ocean was too big for the old man because he tried to own the North Atlantic.
God.
And Gibbs had a sense of modesty. On one hand, he was extremely driven, but I think he was also had a supreme respect for what the ocean could do. And so that went into every aspect of what he designed.
What was the I mean, I don't know if you've done much study of the Titanic, but it really was considered unsinkable, wasn't it? It really was shocking that Mother Nature had the upper hand on technology. I mean, is that true?
Well, the builders described her as the safest ship in the world, and they talked about her watertight compartments. And a shipbuilding publication described the Titanic and her sister ship as practically unsinkable. And so the company never made the claim, but they didn't mind the free publicity. But ultimately they were proved wrong. But the difference between the Titanic and the United States was the Titanic had 16 watertight compartments along her 880-foot length, and any 2 of which could be flooded, or the first 4. Well, that she sideswiped that berg, and the first 6 were open. The United States had 20 watertight compartments and could float with any 5 of them, which is a flooded, which is a standard which is yet to be surpassed in today's commercial ships. So Gibbs really felt it was a responsibility to the people on board that he give them as safe a ship as possible.
And he did this all with models? I mean, how did he know, as not being an architect, how the hell did he know? I guess he worked with engineers.
Yeah, he worked with engineers, and he self-taught a lot of this material himself, but he always built models. His model shop in his office was sort of the sanctum sanctorum. Because he was doing so much work with the military, a lot of his office, you needed clearance.
Yeah.
And so he would build his ships out in the model room. There's one exception to the confidentiality, is that according to one story, a bishop was visiting, who he was friends with, was visiting the office, and he let him into the model room. And the bishop said, "Are you sure you want me to come in here? You know how the clergy people talk." And Gibbs said, "Don't worry, I'm not so much worried about your integrity as the abysmal, but I'm definitely certain about the abysmal ignorance of the things you're about to see." So he also had a really dry sense of humor. I mean, for an engineer, he was often called on to. It's strange. He was often called on to pinch hit at award banquets because he was an engineer that could actually tell jokes. And during one evening at the Waldorf Astoria in the 50s, he was emceeing this event, and it was a very long, very boring evening. A lot of celebrities were in the audience, including Elizabeth Taylor, and he gets up and he sees this bored audience, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've had many sad experiences. This, by far, is the worst."
That's outstanding. Well, he was a dry guy, but I imagine that, this crown jewel, this opus of his, this thing that he spent his whole life developing, became, in his lifetime, obsolete. A rusting sort of relic to his past. That must have been psychologically very devastating. I was thinking about that. It's almost like you spend your whole life with this obsession and doing something you're heralded for, and then in your lifetime it becomes an anachronism. It becomes this giant irrelevance.
Thankfully, he never saw what ultimately happened to the ship. He died in 1967.
Year I was born. Born. So the clouds opened up. But keep going.
The torch was passed.
So you and you and the ship were overlapped for 2 years.
I was born on this ship. My mother scaled it, pregnant, gave birth to me. Man, come on. What are you talking about? By the way, I can't.
That's why you booked me. That's why you wanted.
That's exactly right. I'm good. I'm good on a ship, by the way, as long as it's docked. I get seasick on cruise liners. Okay, I don't even go on cruises. And my question to you is: Did these ships have gyroscopes?
No, the United States did not have stabilizers.
Oh man.
And the ship came out in 1952. The stabilizers came out a few years later, and they put them on several other big ships, including the Queen Mary. But Gibbs refused to have them put on because he felt his ship was perfect.
Wow.
She rolled. I mean, even though she was a big ship, I mean, a lot of the stories I hear from people that were passengers on board or crew involve either drunkenness or seasickness.
Oh, man.
Oh, God.
I bet. What a great time that must have been.
No, regarding him, he died in 1967, and by that time that I mean, it was especially painful because he was on board for that maiden voyage in '52 when she broke the transatlantic speed record, and she crossed the Atlantic in 3 days, 10 hours, and 40 minutes, going the equivalent of 42 miles an hour.
Is that right? It's that
fast?
Yeah,
imagine like the Chrysler Building going that fast.
Are you kidding me? And so it's the size of the Chrysler Building. If you guys haven't been to New York, man, that's a giant building.
Yeah,
okay,
it's pretty close to the Empire State Building.
Yeah, people always think it's the Empire State, but I used to. That's
it's prettier
crazy.
than the Empire State Building.
It is.
Yes, it is.
Attractive.
But that's crazy, Steve. I mean, 42 miles an hour. First of all, let's go through some. I love this stuff because how many gallons of I'm sure it was a clean engine, huh? I'm sure it was greenhouse effective.
Al Gore approved.
It probably is a reason that we have greenhouse warming.
Did you know that the designers of the Toyota Prius actually snuck inside and took no?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
No, they did not get any idea. This ship burned 600 tons of fuel a day of oil.
600
tons.
Wait a minute, 600 tons?
Yes.
Dude, hold on. That's like the equivalent of like I don't know. 10 blue whales or something crazy. All right?
Well, so it didn't burn whale oil.
It actually ran on blue whales. They would just suck 10 blue whales in.
It had a shredder. It had a blue whale shredder. So it wasn't very environmentally friendly. They're so rare. Not another one.
Yeah. So last month I was lecturing on a cruise ship as a history lecture on the Seabourn Sojourn, and this ship crossed the Atlantic. It was a 21-day cruise. Wonderful experience. But at the end of the cruise, the captain announced, so we have traveled about 4,000 miles, and we have burned about 600 tons of fuel. My first thought was, wait a minute, so that's how much the United States would burn in a day, and the Seabourn Sojourn was only going about 15 knots. The United States would go 35.
Wow.
So,
wow.
And her top speed was classified. It was a government secret. She could actually do 38 knots, which is about 45 miles an hour.
That is astounding to me. What kind of propellers? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I didn't know it was that fast.
She had 18-foot bronze propellers. There were 4 of them. And they too were of a top secret design, and they were also designed by the only woman on the engineering team that Gibbs hired. So that was a story.
Well, I don't approve of that at all. But,
no wonder the shipping industry failed.
Yeah, no kidding. You got a chick in there.
Yeah, that's right. They blame it on the airplane, more likely the female.
I'd like to meet that girl. She just has a woman who's just her specialty is propellers. So what do you do, honey? I build top secret propellers.
She was a mathematician right out of Hunter College, and she had a model of that ship in her house in Long Island, and she referred to it as her first baby. But
wow.
Gibbs never saw what happened to it, but he was on that trip for her maiden voyage. He never went on her again, but he would greet that ship every time it came into New York, every 2 weeks.
Wow.
Really? Really?
Yeah, he dropped everything he was doing. He would get up very early in the morning, get in his car, and drive to the Verrazano Narrows, and
I know it.
Stand there and watch for that ship to come in, and then he'd follow it all the way to the West Side Highway, and he would call the ship every day to speak to the captain. If his wife was on board, he'd call her, and someone once asked him, you must love that ship more than your wife, and he said, you're 1,000% correct.
I bet.
That's
a weird necrophiliac. That's sort of
it is a very strange thing. I really don't know. I mean,
it's like guys who polish their cars every day. You know, those guys who. My buddy's dad wouldn't. Artie Lang told me that said that his dad would buy a Cadillac and wouldn't let you open the door if you had rings on. He'd be like, "Let me open the door for you. You got rings on. You're gonna mark up my car." You know that obsession.
No, he was very much that way, but no, he. It's just as well he never saw what happened, but he did. He always kept in touch with people on board. He was very thrilled when celebrities booked on board. It really was like his his child in a way, in a very strange way. But the ironic
maybe not such a strange way though. You know, I mean, how many years did it take him to design it, and how long did the whole project take him?
Well. That's a very good question. I mean, the formal design process began in 1945, and this is an era before any sort of computer-aided design, so it is all being done by hand, all by slide rule. And it took 5 years to get all the drafting done, and then the keel was laid in 1950, and the construction was finished in 52. But he really was working on this design since he was a teenager.
I was going to say this is a culmination of everything he is, an expression of his immortality, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anytime I think it was Seth MacFarlane. I think I talked to a girlfriend of his. He does the Family Guy, and she said that she went back to his school, and when he was in 5th grade, he was drawing cartoons. He was doing this. From most people that do things like this have started it, at a very early age. In a way, it's like, it took me 7 years, took me a lifetime.
Yeah.
Took me a lifetime. When people look at my torso, Steve, they go, "How in the is that genetic?" And yes, it is. Some of it is genetic. I have to be honest, but for the most part, it's a lifetime. It's a lifetime of forging in a ring, on a mat, in a weight room, in a posing room. It is interesting, though, isn't it? I mean, it really is. You can kind of understand a man like this. First of all, thank God for people like this, because we never would have ships and things like that, in my opinion. I don't know that creating something great requires balance in a human being. In fact, balance, a good family man, and all the other things that go with, just sort of what we consider the golden mean, might very well not be what you need to create something like this. We write books and things we write books. You write books, and people like you about these sharp profiles, because in fact they're anything but balanced.
No, it's interesting. When I was doing my research, I stumbled across an article written by a woman that was married to his son's wife, and she basically said that her husband used to take great delight. I mean, they lived in Rockport, Massachusetts. That's where they had a summer home, and Gibbs's wife lived there. And Gibbs's wife loved dogs, and there was a guidebook written at Rockport, Massachusetts, and Francis Gibbs, the son, would say he took great delight that there was an entry on their mother's dogs in this guidebook to Rockport, but nothing about William Francis Gibbs, the man who designed the SS United States.
Wow.
It was pretty. So it was a very, it's typical often with these sorts of people, and I think that.
One of his sons didn't even go to his funeral.
Yeah, no, his other son stayed in California. So I think that I think Gibbs, like Jobs, needed to create this whole separate world around him. I think in the same way that, say, Apple or whatnot was sort of this closed environment. Gibbs's firm was in many ways this controlled environment. All the people that worked there, that was their life. And although as one person who spoke to me who worked there said, you have a bunch of engineers who love ships, it was sometimes the social aspects of it were as awkward as a 7th grade dance.
Yeah. Listen, I mean, the other thing that people never really talk about is it may very well be that someone like this really did have a first and only love. Mm-hmm. That was sitting in a room and drafting ships. Mm-hmm. Say what you will, but that exists. It's I suppose you're supposed to have a biology that is totally devoted to your children. I think I have that with my children, but some people just kind of say, this is what I love. Everything else is kind of a distraction, kind of in the way.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing that I sort of realized when I was writing the book, and this sort of was towards the end when I was interviewing people who were traveled on the ship or worked on the ship, was that the ship carried 1 million passengers during her 17 years in service from 52 to 69, and there's a misconception that these ocean liners just carried rich people and it was all caviar and champagne and all this stuff. Well, yeah, there's plenty of that in the United States. I mean, she carried a lot of very wealthy, very famous people like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Judy Garland.
And there were first-class cabins, obviously. And
yeah. Oh, yeah, and the service, or John Wayne. I mean, these people got the best service they can get of a luxury hotel. But the ship also carried people in cabin and tourist class, and the ship carried a lot of immigrants from Europe. And one story I heard was I was speaking to this young woman who was a student at the Curtis Institute of Music. She was studying cello. And I put up something on Facebook about the ship, and then she says, that's the ship my grandparents met on when they were immigrating to America from Germany, and they ultimately got married. They met on that ship.
Wow.
And I've heard so many stories of that. I mean,
as they were throwing up over the side. Because it had no stabilizers. You're so pretty. That would have
All
been
their wedding photos are
would have been
at
me.
an angle.
That would have been me as a young guy. Not even seasickness would have stopped me from trying to get some tail on the United States.
No, well, it's funny. One story I've heard, the constant story I've heard is that because you had these 3 classes on board, which is something so foreign to us. I mean,
Get closer to the mic, buddy.
When you're on a ship, today on cruise ships you have 1 class, but back then you had 3. So what you often had was you had a lot of students traveling in 3rd class, and often kids who are traveling with their wealthy parents in first class said, well, this is boring. I want to go where all the college kids are. So they would sneak down below and hang out and party in tourist class. But then the tourist class people, a lot of the young women were like, well, we want to go up to first class and do the party.
Yeah.
So
find a rich husband and get pregnant by accidentally on purpose.
Brian's done that before.
Sure I have.
I haven't heard anyone admit to that, but yeah, it was the ship. People were taking this ship, unlike today's cruises where you sort of get on, it's a vacation, and you go. People were taking these ships at very major moments in their lives. They were moving, they were immigrating, they were going. If they were film stars, they were going on film shoots. They were going for once-in-a-lifetime vacations. So the ship carried a lot of servicemen to occupy Germany, a lot of U.S. servicemen. So I've spoken to people who were children who traveled with their parents who were with their fathers who were military officers, and for them this was an unforgettable experience. But also cruise ship, transatlantic ships back then, a contrast to today's ships. And you mentioned children. Today's cruise ships have all sorts of activities for children. Well, transatlantic liners were not kid-friendly. The kids were put off in the nursery, and the adults did their thing. So
was there a pool on board or anything like that?
There was a pool on board. It was located in the bottom of the ship, and there was no outdoor pool because this was a ship designed for the North Atlantic.
Yeah, that's great. Just a chlorine chamber. Just a chlorine chamber where you could jump into some little pool. Ah, delicious.
Yeah, and it's so cold outside. You don't.
Yeah, that's true. It is. And let me ask you this: were there any murders on board that you know of?
Oh boy, I haven't come across any, but there were some suicides. I've spoken to some to one crew member who said that he saw one take place. Some guy took his shoes off. He was walking along the deck, took his shoes off, and then jumped.
Mm-hmm.
And
happens all the time on ships, actually.
This guy the ship turned around, and he said that because they were going so fast, the ship was really heeling over 20 degrees, but they couldn't find it. But apparently that happened a few times. But
wow.
And there was a case of a theft of someone raided the cruise safe, and the cruise safe was used to have the savings of the crew members, but a lot of it was money from running numbers and all sorts of and poker games and all sorts of.
Oh, right, there was a lot of gambling.
So someone broke into the cruise safe, and they ended up catching him about 10 years later, and he was accused of piracy on the high seas, the first time that had been done in years. So,
Wow. Man, oh man, forget rating that. I would have gone from first class down to the common cattle and said, "Hey, any of you ladies want to make some money or what?"
There's a story. The crew, one crew member said that there were all sorts of interesting characters who were on the 800 people that were on the crew, and he said at night there was so much gambling going on, it was like a psychiatric ward.
Oh, I bet.
But yeah, I mean, there's one story of Marlon Brando who was sick of being surrounded by autograph seekers that he said, I don't want to hang out with the passengers. He asked the steward, can I come down and play my guitar for the crew? And so he goes into a cabin, and a few people are around, and Marlon Brando walks in, and he starts playing his guitar. Next thing you know, it was Bill Krudner, the steward, told me, all of a sudden like 500 guys are crammed into the room, and some guys take out their guitars and play.
Wow.
That's awesome.
All of a sudden, Marlon Brando and his bad guitar playing, right? Yeah, the power of celebrity, man. It was alive in 1952 and the same thing today.
That's amazing.
Hey, you guys mind come down and I strum this shitty guitar?
And you can all pretend that it sounds like music.
Yeah. And now a little flamenco from Marlon Brando with his thick, angry fingers as he strums away. And we all throw up from seasickness.
Because the ship was perfect.
Exactly. I'm still kind of like blown away by the 42 miles an hour and the 600 tons of fuel a day. I mean, what kind of a fuel tank did this have, and how many tons did it actually take? Put that in perspective.
Well, let's put it this way. She could steam 10,000 miles without stopping. She could, if she was to become a troop ship, and she was built to be turned into a troop ship should war break out.
Yeah.
In fact, she was designed first as a troop ship and a cruise ship, and as a troop ship, and then as and then the passenger ship components were sort of added in. She could be converted within 48 hours from being a 2,000 passenger luxury passenger ship into a 14,000 soldier troop ship.
You know what's funny about that? You know what's funny as you say that? I'm going to tell you right now, the military was lying about that. That's overly optimistic. That's like, we can turn this thing in 48 hours. No, you can't. It's way too big.
I'm sure they were. It never happened, so they never had.
Yeah.
It was never. So they never. It was part of the publicity. It
sure,
was a way of getting people interested. But she could supposedly steam from San Francisco to Asia and back without refueling, carrying a full Army division.
That's incredible to me. That is just incredible.
Wow.
That is a marvel. That is such a. I mean, and here's my other question. I'm sorry to interrupt you because I just want to stop. When you have a situation like that, what about fire and the fact that you've got this crazy bomb on board? I mean, I don't know much about fuel dynamics and stuff, but it just strikes me as was it oil? It wasn't gasoline. It was oil, I guess, right?
Yeah, it was bunker C oil, which burns at a very high temperature. And the ship was built to be as fireproof as possible. And unlike older ships, there was almost no wood used. I mean, the joke was that the only wood on the ship was in the butcher's block and the pianos. And there was almost Gibbs tried to get Steinway to build an aluminum frame, 5 aluminum frame pianos for the ship.
Oh,
and
I see. Yeah.
Said, no way, that's going to sound terrible. So they got wood on board. But in substitution for all the wood that's usually used on a passenger ship, like older ships, like the Queen Mary, Gibbs was like, he was very fond of this miracle material that was strong and
aluminum.
Lightweight.
Yeah, aluminum.
And, there was aluminum used in the upper decks, but also asbestos.
Oh, my God.
One of the largest uses of asbestos up to that time, and they didn't know back then.
Yeah, but it was it was insulated, the asbestos, right? Wasn't it?
It was insulated, yeah. So, but yeah, they didn't know any better back in the 40s. But
God.
But yeah, I mean, she was. There was no major accident on board. There was no collision, no fire really. But the oil was pretty well insulated. There wouldn't be any sort of explosion. But just getting back to the Titanic, just briefly, one thing that a lot of people don't know about it is that when she set off on her maiden voyage in 1912, she was actually on fire. There was a coal fire raging in her bunker.
Kind of like how I am 24/7. But keep going.
So.
What's so great about this book, I think, is there are so many resonances with the modern day. Obviously, you talked about William Francis Gibbs being like Steve Jobs, but the other one that I really got was, this whole race to be the fastest ship across the Atlantic. It reminded me so much of the space race. And I mean, I think we recently had David Gran on, who wrote The Lost City of Z. And, he's about this explorer who was so famous in his own time, and now we've almost forgotten about it. But yeah, I mean, being able to look back at earlier instances of exactly what's going on in our world today, I think is so helpful because it helps you see those patterns so much more clearly.
No, I think it's a very illuminating thing about how transient fame is, and how something that is cutting edge technology one day can be sort of this quaint curiosity, the next minute. And I think it's also a reminder of a time when America we are a nation I really believe we're a nation of builders, and this ship was an ultimate expression of building something that's, in Gibbs's view, unassailable and beautiful at the same time. But I think it's also a lesson in how do I put it, about someone who really did sort of defy what people were telling him to do, and he said, "I'm going to do this," and then he ends up getting, at least for the end of his life, the recognition that he felt he had worked towards. But I think it is, looking at the ship now, she's now this rusted hulk sitting in Philadelphia. It's faded. The red, white, and blue stacks are faded. She's rusted. People just drive right past the ship. They don't know it. Well, when she arrived in New York for the first time in 1952, before her maiden voyage, you had thousands of people waiting online to get on board. She was making the papers. Everyone wanted. She was sold out that first voyage. Everyone was excited, partially because of that degree of mystery. In many ways, it was kind of like the rollout of the next Apple product. Everyone wanted to know, but there's a secrecy about it. And now here she is in Philadelphia, in the hometown of her designer, and I feel that in many ways it's fitting. Whatever ultimately happens to the ship, it's fitting that she came back to Philadelphia, because that's the same. She's docked on the same river where in 1894, an 8-year-old boy named William Francis Gibbs stood at his father's side and watched this ocean liner called the St. Louis launched into the Delaware River, and he said, "From that moment, I knew what I wanted to do when I grew up."
Yeah.
And now that ship has come back to that same river, only a mile from where that happened. And I think whatever ultimately happens to the ship, the real privilege for me has been saving the story. And that's been the real privilege for me in writing this book.
And saving the ship as well. There are now efforts to preserve her underway, aren't there?
There are, yes. She is now owned by the SS United States Conservancy, of which I'm on the advisory council of, and
it's so obscure. It's so great. By the way, I'm an advisor on the advisory board for the USS. Anyway, you got to read my book.
But no, it's the ship. The organization received a very generous grant a few years ago from a man called Jerry Lenfest, who's a philanthropist in Philadelphia, whose father helped design the ship, and he's now become he's a multi-millionaire. He made it in cable. And he gave
I love it. For all the crap I put out there, here's some money to save like an ancient relic.
No. Well, he really believed that this was something worth saving, but the Conservancy received a grant to buy the ship, but now and to maintain the ship for a certain period of time, but now that money is the grant has run out, so now the question is what will happen to it. If she's saved, it would take a real estate deal, but to make it happen.
Well, turn it into apartments, for God's sake.
Yeah, exactly.
No, what about how in the world have ships changed besides fuel economy? They're not any faster.
They're bigger.
They do have stabilizers. There was an article in the New York Times, a couple days ago about how big these ocean liners have become now, which is fine, but the actual design of a ship really hasn't changed that much, has it?
It has changed enormously.
They
are.
Don't ever contradict me on my show. For God's sake, have some respect, man.
I'll never make that mistake again.
Yeah, it's not like you wrote a book on building ships, but keep
you're off the phone right now.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, the United States would be considered a small ship today. She's 50,000 tons. You have ships today which are 250,000 tons. They're basically floating malls.
Yeah.
And they're basically geared towards consuming, towards having as much retail on board. And when you booked passage on the SS United States in the 50s, it was all inclusive. You could eat all you want and everything. Today there are all sorts of charges they put in there, but also the thing I find fascinating is this whole thing of balconies. Everyone wants a balcony on their cabin, and in the old days, people would be happy with just a porthole. But back on a ship like the United States, you'd have these enclosed promenade decks which encircled the ship, and people would walk around. It's like a C&BC thing. Now it's people want these little outdoor private deck areas, and private space is very important.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, people want entertainment. Back when the United States was built, you'd watch some cheesy magic show, or you'd dance with the orchestra, or you'd play cards or whatnot.
I mean, God, I'm so glad I live in an age of drums and electronics. I mean, what a bore.
But today, people want Broadway shows. They want, the whole 9 yards. They want specialty dining experiences. So it's much more. It's almost more like a floating mall or resort. The United States, it was very nice. The service was fantastic. It was very comfortable, but you were traveling from one place to another.
Mm-hmm. Right. Amazing. Now, do you have plans to write another book?
Yes, I'm working on a second book on. I'm going back 100 years to clipper ships, the great tall ships that sailed from America to China and to California. So there is speed, gold, and opium involved.
There you go. I literally just, my eyes lit up when you were like clipper ships. I was like, all right, here goes with Steve again. Another book on shipping, which will probably be just as successful because you're really good at this. But opium? Wait a minute.
Yeah, opium was used in the China trade. A lot of merchants in New England and New York, the Chinese, America and especially England didn't have a lot of goods the Chinese wanted to buy in the first half of the 19th century. So
we made them sell opium.
Yeah,
we made them buy our opium. Actually, yeah.
So that's what actually fuels a lot of the China trade.
So
I'm working on. I'm focusing on one designer, a guy called Donald McKay, who was a Canadian immigrant who built a lot of the great clippers, including, and they had these really poetic names that were very, sort of reflected the 19th century romantic movement, like Flying Cloud or Witch of the Wave or things like that. And people bet on them like racehorses.
Really?
People would bet on them. Okay, how long would it take for the Flying Cloud to get to California? How long will it take the Witch of the Wave to get to China? And huge sums were. I mean, if you think the America's Cup is fascinating, imagine 3 or 4 clipper ships, each with masts 100 or 200 feet tall, 200 feet long in these ships, setting off and racing around, leaving New York and racing around Cape Horn to California, often within view of each other.
Wow.
Well, it doesn't look. This is human, right? This is certainly male, anyway. I mean, look at drag racing. It's just a glorified version of, this is how we, for whatever reason, men are always like, I got something faster, stronger, taller, longer. I climb Mount Everest not for the view, but just so I can stick my flag in the top and say, I've been there, you haven't, loser. Sure, I lost some toes in the end of my nose from frostbite, but I win.
Brian does that to me all the time.
All the time.
He's always, you should see, he's ridiculous. Like, his screensaver is the Everest picture.
Exactly.
His phone is the Everest selfie.
Sure, I didn't climb it, but in my mind.
But through the power of Photoshop.
That's it. Mott, you've got a strong Dutch constitution. You belong on the seas, man, with that tailpiece of yours.
Well,
Steve, can't thank you enough for joining us. We really appreciate people like you because I just had to get you on because I just thought, what kind of a man would spend this much time writing a book about a man and his ship and do that well at it? And congrats on the success of the book.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on, and thank you.
Yeah, and you'll be. I expect you in the front row. I'll put you on my list. I'll get to you via email. Or your assistant. I'm sure you're vastly wealthy now that you've written a manuscript.
No assistant at this point.
Exactly. Yeah, just talk to my secretary. I'll be busy writing a book on clippers. But I'll try to find an hour to come out and laugh at you at helium.
And I'm drinking tea and smoking opium.
Exactly.
As research.
Yeah, you just come out high as shit. Steve, you're nodding off on opium, bro. This is terrible. My God, dude! I know you're a method writer, but this is over the top. Yeah. Good luck on your fellowship, my friend, and thanks once again from Brian Callen and Hunter Motts, whatever.
Whatevs.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it.
All right, have a great day, Steve.
Okay, bye-bye.
He's a good man.
He's a great man. I would also the other thing that you've got to figure that this guy has naval groupies. Like, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like every field, there are weird groupies, and he's got to have like all of these people who are like
strange.
sending him, fanboy emails about like how much they enjoyed his description of those bronze propellers.
My father loves airplanes. Like he's into like that right there is a 707 back in 1952. Hey, dude, how about not boring me to death? I don't care about your 707, but you need people who have these niche interests.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there are more of them than ever. I mean, that's so much of what Chris Anderson writes about in The Long Tail is that, you could, 30 years ago, you could not have gotten this book written or had this book be such a huge success. But he can write it, and through the power of the interweb, all the naval groupies can find the book, and they can turn it into a hit.
I like that you call it the interweb. I call it the internet, but so what? If you want to start playing with language. You're right, though, man. It really is true. I was just thinking about how his mental space is allocated to a man on a ship. I probably spend, I think, 80% of my time just thinking about round ass and in high heels, and then the rest about just being somebody with a machine gun breaking into, buildings, saving hot chicks. So they me more round ass. I mean, I don't know what I think about, but, it's just funny how I've got to start getting more disciplined with my thought. I got to start getting a little more productive. Thank God for you and getting these great guests, because I just be like, what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to go lift weights and not grow. It's nuts. You still doing CrossFit?
Yeah, I am.
Good man. Good man. Your back is looking good. You got a wide back.
Listen, it's what percentage of my day do I spend thinking about my wide back?
Listen, you don't. You're too intelligent. Let me think about it. It's like the kid's got a wide Dutch back. Built for rowing or something.
It is built for rowing.
Have you done any cross transatlantic
rowing?
Rowing, sailing.
Actually, I was on. I think I was on the QE2 when I was super young.
Yeah, I did a cruise. I've done a couple of cruises. Hate it. Hate it.
It is pretty boring.
I can't stand any of it. I don't care how luxurious it is. I don't like being on a boat.
Being on a cruise reminds me of being on the beach, but you can't leave.
Oh, God, exactly. And the ocean is very, very scary. The idea of, I looked out and I wouldn't even go outside at night. I was like, there might be some psycho waiting just to toss me over.
Well, I did think that question. Was anybody ever murdered on the ship? Listen, that clearly came from your private world.
It happens. Yeah. For me, it's just like, I don't, being in the middle of the ocean, it was so black. It was so, you couldn't see the hand in front of your face. Being in that ocean and just bobbing around in mile-deep, icy cold water with giant carnivorous fish. Go fuck yourself. Not a shot. That you can do anything. I'd rather die of fire than that. At least fire's fast. So anyway, that's my own personal little thing. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us on this incredible excursion. I hope you learned everything about
the SS United States. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Many thanks to Steve.
Yeah, Steve's
Ujifusa.
awesome.
Yeah, and it's a good book. So there it is. Yeah. We'll be back. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Bryan Callen Show. Be sure to visit bryancallen.com for information about this episode as well as past and future episodes. You can follow Bryan on Twitter @BryanCallen and like him on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/BryanCallenComedy. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.